Hi, how are you guys doing? So this is a little bit an experiment for me because I'm trying to get better at streaming. So thank you for joining tonight. And I do want to design live and see where it takes us and if it's interesting. Today we're going to discuss about blobs. And we've been redesigning the iOS app lately. And the way that I work typically is that I like to start with a basic design first. And it also has to do a lot with our limitations, the time that we have to spend on design, me having to create a lot of courses for customers. And so, the first iteration of design is pretty basic. I mean, it does a fairly good job at conveying some of the original design from the website. But this time I wanted to elevate it a little bit. So I've been creating some new screens lately. I've been sharing that on Twitter, on Instagram, and YouTube. So these are some of the screens. So for example, we started with the onboarding screen. And then I started kind of like looking at different ways to design the cards. When you design, I think it's important sometimes to put in perspective and also to present it in a way that you can sort of like pass the message and excite people in the team. So that's kind of like what I've been trying to do. Part of a job of a more senior designer, I would say, is to kind of start the culture, the design language, which is not always easy. Especially if you're a junior designer. So let's say, your company or your team needs like a new design language or something started from scratch. If you face with that, then you have to sort of like know where to find the inspiration. You have to, understand the process and all of that stuff. So this is kind of like part of my responsibility. So for example, I'm working with Siri in the team, and he relies on me to sort of like start with a design language, and he's going to take it from there. So he's very, very good at that. But definitely part of the process is to get everyone on board, not just the designers, but also the developers, how it's going to be implemented. And, sometimes it's also a question of time. So how long do you have to design this, or such and such things? And I think it's really important to be mindful of, the time frame that you have. So if you have more time, if you work in a bigger team, typically you're going to be spending a lot more time on the details, such as, each of the artworks and the gradients, the colors, the branding. And then you get into the prototyping, which takes a massive amount of time for most designers in the team. But the thing is, in our team, we don't have that luxury. Like, we just go, head on, and we just like have fun. And we don't have, weeks and weeks to just work on a single card or just work on a single, piece of typography or the branding or logo or, a piece of art. So we try to do it in the most efficient way possible as a team. And, sometimes we end up with something a little bit more basic. Sometimes we focus more our time in the coding. So, all of that is really up to you. But that's kind of what works for us. And sorry, I don't know why I'm explaining the process right now. I'm a little bit nervous. I tend to ramble a lot. So, all right, so let me just focus back on the design here. I've been trying to, to kind of like start a new design, like inject new life into the design, from here to here, right? Like, there's not much of a difference. At the same time, I have to be mindful of the implementation, because as a designer who codes, I understand the complexity of redesigning an app. And that's the last thing I want to do, is to kind of like scrap what we have done so far, which is already like almost ready for release. And to basically take those limitations and those constraints in mind and say, well, what is the maximum thing we can do and still making it exciting? So, for example, you're noticing here the title placement, the card placements are essentially the same, okay? From the old design to the new design. So in that sense, when it comes to coding, it's not going to take a lot of time to redo this. So that was really important for me, because I don't want to completely change the whole layout, the whole logic, and the whole navigation. I just wanted to elevate it aesthetically, but also to push the details a little bit more. So that was my goal here. And as you can see, the title placement, the card placement, you know, and the content. So when we go to the section, the course, so all of these things are essentially more like reworking the details rather than redesigning the entire structure, if you understand what I mean. So that's my goal. And, you know, this is the journey I want to take you with me. Hopefully you enjoy understanding like kind of like the process. But yeah, you know, one of the things that really drove this new redesign is typically for me, the illustrations, the colors, and whatever inspires us as designers. So, you know, oftentimes a lot of designers say, well, we don't really care that much about, you know, aesthetics and stuff like that. I disagree, because to me, aesthetics is kind of one of those things where, you know, you get inspired. It's like you walk into nature, you see a beautiful waterfall, or you see a bird or a tree or the sunset, and then suddenly you have this surge of inspiration that goes through your veins, and you're like, oh my God, I have to do something about, you know, what's going on in my mind. And I'm like, okay, well, let me redesign this. And so that's kind of like why I think inspiration is so important. So this all started really a lot thanks to the illustrations that we had, thanks to our amazing team. We've been kind of creating these cover images, these backgrounds, and you know, we have a team of designers who work on the angle mockups, who work on some of these beautiful backgrounds that you can see on the website, the illustrations. And lately, we've been trying to elevate the presentation a little bit more, because we have the bandwidth, we have more experience now. At the beginning, you know, while we were kind of building shape at the time, we sort of like kind of like touched mostly on the flat colors. But eventually we wanted to kind of build on top of some of these presentations, such as this one, or I think there's the Flutter one. Let me show you here. Okay, so for example, this one is using a little bit of background blur here. So there's a bit more gradient and effects going on. So we want to elevate that. And when you elevate something, it's kind of like a domino effect, and it inspires other things. It's important in your team to have people who are really, really inspiring. When you have people who are really inspiring, they inspire you to do good work. So this is this is where the inspiration begins. If you look at some of these really awesome illustrations that took a lot of time to create from scratch, the processes and all that stuff. So we inspire each other. And that's kind of like what we're trying to do here. So with that inspiration, what do? You come back to your design, you come back to your app, and you're like, what if I use these colors instead? What if I use this, image instead? And how will it impact the new design? So for example, if I wanted to use this illustration here, like how can I use it in a way that is going to elevate my current design? I can't just drop it here and expect that to fit with the rest of the illustrations. I had to completely rethink about how it's going to create a new language for our illustrations moving forward. So we all started with this, right? Like one of the things that I really love about iOS and also Glassmorphism is that Glassmorphism is not a bad UI trend. In fact, it's something that is simply like an evolution of iOS, the blur layers that has been around for a while. So it's not necessarily new. It's not like new morphism, which is a completely different language, and it's taking a lot of the old style of skeuomorphism. To me, Glassmorphism is just, elevating a little bit with drop shadows and a little bit of outline to make sort of like a glass effect. So it fits very well with where design is going. And, it's not in the way. It doesn't have like a ton of inner shadows or drop shadows and, like lighting effects. It's simply a blur layer with an outline. That's it. So sometimes you use a little bit of drop shadows and stuff like that. And at the same time, it also has a purpose, right? So the purpose is really to focus on the content. So without that glass layer, you can see that this text here is less readable. So if you place it correctly, then your glass layer is actually helping. Just like in iOS, the blur layer does help quite a bit. Just get it back. All right. This is really challenging for me because, when I'm live streaming, the computer goes crazy. So, when you work with this speed, it's really, not inspiring to kind of like do it live. But I'm gonna do my best. I do look forward to having the new M1 computers from Apple, which is really gonna speed up the process. And especially when they're gonna come up with the new chips, probably in the new MacBook 16-inch. So I'm looking forward to that. But in the meantime, we're gonna have to deal with the slowness here as I live stream. So this is where it started. It started with the inspiration from the illustrations, the blobs here. And I mentioned some of the techniques that are really, really cool, which is, you're using a radial gradient. Okay. You can see here this blob is using a radial gradient, and then you put a blur layer on top, and it creates this kind of like 3D-ish blob. And I was really inspired by that technique. So, I was playing around with that. And here, today I played around with that a little bit. So changing the gradient colors a little bit. And I thought, wow, this is actually quite interesting. If you look at here, I changed the colors a little bit by using kind of like a rainbow-ish colors. And it's still a radial gradient. So if I delete that, you can see it's basically a radial gradient with a blurred circle in the middle. And yeah, that's essentially what it is. And on top of that, you can export that to PDF. You can export that to SVG because the entire thing is not a bitmap. So for example, if you were rendering this in 3D, it's not in vector, which means you don't have the same amount of flexibility for animations, for editing and stuff like that. Oftentimes, as a designer, you're gonna have to play with an already made illustration or icon, and then you have to make sure that it fits into your current design. So that's kind of like part of the designer's job. And sometimes you have to make it fit the design. So sometimes you can have to change the colors to fit the gradient colors. Sometimes you want to elevate it. And this is exactly what I'm trying to do. So let me explain what I'm trying to do here. So none of this is using blending effect, by the way. And the reason why I'm not using blending effects is because I'm not planning to implement this in code separately. The whole thing is going to be an illustration. Okay, so this simplifies the process a little bit. If I had to implement everything in code separately using blending mode, then since we have 30 courses, I'm gonna have to sort of like create a process in which every single of these illustrations needs to be animated, needs to be implemented from scratch. So as a result, I'm like, well, maybe we don't need to get there. So maybe we can sort of like use this as simply a PDF image or SVG image but if you want to work with SVG image or PDF, you cannot use blending mode. It's not going to work well. So none of this is going to use blending mode, but what it will use is transparency and blur. So one of the things that really inspires me is, what Apple has been doing recently with some of these 3D effects here. So I believe it's probably using a movie file, or it's probably using, maybe a 3D rendering movie file. So they're cheating a little bit. I might be wrong. Maybe they're actually using some sort of a WebGL thing, which would be interesting. But I will show you an example of where they do use not like a movie file, because when you use a movie file, it's kind of like cheating. So I believe that Stripe is actually using Canvas and WebGL and stuff like that to create these beautiful effects here. And I have yet to learn that, so this is something that really interests me. But this is what allows to create these animations, these blending effects that you see here. And when you go to each page, the colors changes, it's dynamic. And that's kind of like essentially what you want to do. Because if you have a movie file, then you don't have the same flexibility to change the colors, to animate the shapes, and to make it move around, like a water effect or something like that. So that would be ultimately the goal for me. I don't like to have to kind of like create a new movie file for every single illustration, right? Like, I think that would be a little bit overkill. So I'm definitely passionate about sort of like trying to do that in CSS, trying to do that in WebGL or 3GS. I did some of that, but it does not work for every single browser. So let me give you an example of something that is very easy to do in CSS and that I actually figured out, but I don't believe it worked in Chrome. So the technology is not there yet, but you can see here, this layer here is using a background blur plus a blur effect, which is why it's dynamic. So if I move it around, okay, if I move it around, sorry, it's a little bit slow, you can see that it changes and it blurs the shapes while changing the colors of the background. And this is very inexpensive. I didn't have to use WebGL and stuff like that. But at the same time, I think, if I'm not wrong, it doesn't work for Chrome. So it only works for Safari. Okay, so you can see it's contextual to the background itself, and it blurs the lines. And that's kind of like the goal that I was trying to achieve. So I haven't figured it out yet, but this is something that really interests me. But from an illustration perspective, the goal would be to do the same. So as you can see here, even though I'm not going to animate this because I don't like, I want to learn how to do this in code, but I don't know yet. So it's just going to be static. So you can see that this is going to be using the radial gradient, okay, with a layer blur. So if I don't set the blur, it's simply a layer like this. But look at how interesting that is. I mean, by adding the layer blur, it creates this really beautiful sort of like organic 3D-ish blob. It's really nice. I really like it personally. And so you can create really interesting stuff with the blur, with the radial gradient, and with the blob shape. For those who kind of like want to create this from scratch, there are like a bunch of plugins, or you can do that from scratch by, I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's a circle. Okay, wow, really slow. So let me go here. I'm gonna go to the shape, and I believe I have to go to the edit mode. And here you can go to the blend tool, and you can basically move these things around like this. You can also like mirror and length. So yeah, so you can play around like this, and so this is kind of like the manual way. I like to do the manual way. As a designer, you should kind of like learn the manual way. The blend tool is really nice as well. So you can essentially go to edit mode. So first of all, I'm going to press enter. And here I'm going to use the blend tool, and you can just move this around like that, right? So the blend tool is really nice. So you can really create like interesting shape. Otherwise, there are plugins in Figma. So I'm going to go to the community and the plugins tab. There are a bunch of plugins such as Wave or, and Blob. There's also Looper, where you can create these kind of like beautiful backgrounds, wireframes, and stuff like that. So let's give that a try. I'm gonna go to the menu here and go to plugins. I believe there's one called Blob. So the blob, you can set the complexity and you can set the contrast and stuff like that and make the blob, and boom, it creates this for you, right? Like, if you don't know where to start, let the tool do that for you, right? And then afterwards, you still need to kind of like edit it and to make sure that it doesn't look weird, because, computers are not perfect, even though we wish that they can create the pieces of art that enthralls us, but it's not always the case, right? So a lot of times you're gonna have to do these things manually. So yeah, this is how do you create these blobs. You can create these imperfect circle, which is kind of like a blob. Interestingly, this shape is pretty easy to do in CSS, so I actually did this in the courses page. So when you see the first animation, this is actually a CSS circle. Is it a circle? It's a shape that actually changes in terms of like the shape itself, like the, how do you say? Well, it just moves like a blob a little bit. So that was created in CSS, and it's pretty cool. I think if I search like for CSS blob, I think I can find the code somewhere. Right. Anyways, you can easily do this in CSS is what I mean. And you can Google that, you can find that. It's really not hard to do. the question is, you know, how are you going to animate it? How are you going to apply with gradients? How are you going to play with blur? And that's kind of like the big challenge moving forward. All right. So as you can see, you know, oftentimes you have like an original illustrations, you have an original idea, and you have to morph it into something else because you don't want to repeat the same illustration, but you still want to reuse something that fits. You know, you don't want to have two completely different illustrations that might not fit with each other. So for example, you know, these three fits with each other. So it's just a matter of playing with the shapes and move them around. And so that's exactly what I did here. So, you know, you can see that this is basically an iteration of this one. Okay. And I wanted to play a little bit more with the blur effect, which is what creates this sort of like organic blob thing. And that's ultimately the goal. And eventually in the future, I would like to be able to animate that so that we have an effect like on the iTunes, you know, or Stripe. So the ultimate goal is to have an effect like this, which has a bunch of gradients and, you know, a lot of like really cool lighting effects, animations, and the blob kind of like moving around organically. So that's kind of like the goal for me. And, you know, when you play with gradients, you can also have something like this. So this is a play button. And again, I use the same technique. I was very inspired by that technique. So I created like a circle to hide this little, you know, annoying little cheesy radial gradient diamond thing on the top. So this is not what I want. So that's why by setting a circle in the middle with a blur, it creates this almost 3D play button. So that makes it a lot more interesting while not necessarily creating like a bitmap asset, which is never like, it ideally should not be the goal when you're doing UI design, right? If you're creating a movie, a promo video, or a presentation, that's fine. But when it comes to creating UI design for an app, you want people to be able to interact. You want to have the flexibility to animate it and to pair it with gestures and maybe to change the colors and stuff like that. So that's why ultimately you want to use vectors. So anyways, let's design something together. I'm going to be answering questions if you guys have anything about this. So, you know, I've been redesigning some of these screens. Let me explain some of the decisions that I made here. So one of the challenges that I had was like, okay, well, you have this little avatar on the top right, and it's kind of like, it's basic, okay? And I don't mean that in a bad way. Like, you know, sometimes it's fine to have a basic design, but I thought, well, you know, what if we use a glassmorphic, like a glass layer, or, you know, what if, right? Like the question is what if? So I was like, okay, you know, I would take this glass layer here, but then it looks, you know, I bring the glass layer and it's, you know, it looks like it's not even there. And I was like, well, how do I make it so that it looks like a glass layer? Because if you have a white background, what is the point of that glass layer? It makes sense when you have like these blobs here to pair it against that glass layer. But when you have a white background, it's like, it's not there. So I was like, well, what if we had some sort of like, you know, an iTunes-ish blob gradient color in the background that would change across multiple screens, right? So you can see that these are different colors depending on the screen, okay? What if I could animate this in SwiftUI, right? Because it's easy to animate this in SwiftUI. And you know, if you worry about performance, it can happen maybe in the first 1 second, or it can happen when you tap on this, right? So based on interaction, you don't have to do like a loop animation, which yes, is going to take a lot of CPU. So if you do worry about performance, you can animate that on, you know, at certain timing, right? So, you know, what if, for example, at the first application load, you have this little planet here in the background that goes in the back of the avatar, creating this beautiful glass effect. So that was kind of the idea. And what if this background layer here, which creates a beautiful kind of color gradient, could be slightly animated, okay? And that creates a little bit of context and a little bit of, it adds a little bit of life to the UI. And again, those are all what ifs, right? You know, I think it's important to experiment. It's not a question of like, is this the right thing for you or not? It's just a question of, let's experiment. Let's see if it actually works. And, you know, when we're going to get into the code, when we're going to, you know, implement the animations, we're going to have a feel if this actually works or not. So the same with the cards, right? Like, what if we have a glass layer? Okay. And then we surround that against the logo, and then we put that on top of the illustration, right? So this is before, which is pretty basic. Nothing wrong with basic. And this is after, right? What if? The same with these cards. And now this is where I wanted to elevate, because what I felt was, okay, you have the course cards. Okay, that's fine. And then you have the tutorial cards, which is kind of like the same, but it's missing the illustration. I was like, well, what if we do have an illustration for the illustration for the tutorial cards, and the same for the live stream cards. Okay, this was done a little bit in a rush, so we didn't have any illustrations. We're using the gradient for every single card. They have their own gradients, and they have their own illustrations. So every single course, every single section is going to have its own illustration, and we have like a very solid process to make that happen. Okay, but I thought, well, what if we elevate that? You know, let's spend a little bit more time on the details. So on the website, you know, I tried this concept of animated cards, right? So this is a single layer of background blur, and this is the gradient of the course. So every single course has a gradient. So when you have a background blur against the gradient, it creates this beautiful effect. And it's all dynamic, meaning that the colors are hex codes entered in the database, which is Contentful in our case. And using that gradient, we have, you know, like specific branding for each of the course, right? Using that gradient. And then when you go to the course page, then that gradient is also expressed here. And express here. Now this is using hue saturation. Hue saturation is when you change the hue in code, and so you do this hue rotate. So from pink you can go to red, you can go to purple, and that's why, even though the original gradient here is reddish, when I mouse over, it's actually pink. And the reason why it's pink is because I'm using hue rotation. And let me give you another example. So you can see this is purple and this becomes blue. And you know, it can be interesting. It adds a little bit of the concept of analogous colors, or you know, sometimes you can use complementary colors so that you have two colors that complement each other. And you know, we wanted to translate that, but back to the idea of the card, I wanted to see, well, what if I do that also for the iOS app? Instead of, you know, creating something like this, which is pretty basic, nothing wrong. I have something like this. So I started with the white version, and I also played with the dark version. So this is using a slightly dark blue color so that the hue is not completely black. Sometimes a gray color or a black color is a little bit boring, and you want to use more contextual colors, especially when you're working with colors, because if you think about real life, the lighting in your room is always influenced by the lighting, by the environment, right? The light itself, it's not black and white. So, that's why, nowadays you're going to see a lot of drop shadows that are not necessarily black drop shadows. They're more like blue drop shadows. And iTunes does that a lot as well. If I'm not mistaken here. So let's hope it's not going to play the music. But they do use like this, this drop shadow that is colored drop shadow. So yeah, I've been playing a lot with the glass layer. The glass layer allows for better readability on the content versus the background. Therefore, you can decide to make your illustration bigger. If you don't do that, if you don't have a glass layer, let me show you. This is hard to read, okay? And as a result, as a designer, you have to kind of like move it around or making it smaller. Or you have to add some sort of like a mask in order to make sure that your text is readable. So oftentimes to resolve this, we use the glass layer or the background blur layer. So that's what allows me to make the illustration bigger as a result. Likewise here, I move the illustration down a little bit, and here we have a lot of text. If I remove the glass layer, then this text will not be very readable. The same with the menu here. Now, this is kind of interesting. This is something that I just played with. It's more like so when you tap on it, there's like a circle, like a sonar kind of thing. And I thought, well, what if I added a little circle that looks like a planet that moves around a solar system? So maybe it can move from here to here, and then it opens the popover. I don't know. Just ideas. I'm just throwing around. And then the same with this button here. I was like, well, what if I tap on it and it looks like a Dragon Ball? I'm just kidding. It does look like a Dragon Ball for some reason, but that was not the intention. It's just because I was playing with this gradient here, and then I was playing with this gradient. I applied to this shape here, and then I put the favorite, which is one of the features, and it just happens to look like a Dragon Ball. So this is what we have so far. And yeah, I had a lot of fun with playing with these colors. What else? And now, since I have sort of established the new design language, now it's time for me to kind of like pass around to the rest of the team, so Syria can start and kind of like take inspiration from it and respect sort of like the design language and the constraints. We don't necessarily want to redesign the entire app, so that's kind of like part of my feedback to Syria is like, don't limit your creativity, but at the same time, please keep in mind that we're not trying to redesign the entire app. So Syria has been playing around a little bit with redesigning the login and also the profile. So it's getting interesting, it's getting there. And now, before we finish this live stream, let's redesign one screen together. Would you like that? All right. So let's redesign the profile page. So the profile page is one that I actually, I don't dislike it. It's a bit basic on the top level, but the bottom part I kind of like it. you know, we have these cards, and when you tap on the card, it kind of flips around. We do have the animation SwiftUI. We have the test flight if you want to test the beta test the app. It flips around and it goes to this screen here. So I do like that. I'm pretty satisfied with this, but let's see if we can redesign this together. Okay. Now, as a designer, you don't want to kind of completely change the whole structure. So, you know, we're going to change a bunch of things, but not everything. So let's start with the structure. We have the avatar, we have the name, we have the bio. So avatar. Actually, let me just start from scratch so that you can follow. All right. Typically, the way that I like to create a new screen, I duplicate it. I don't like to start from scratch, especially when you have like a consistent design language. You duplicate something, you pick the screen that is closest to what you're trying to achieve. So for example, if I want to work on a section screen, well, it's very similar to the core screen. The difference is that the core screen is going to allow you to navigate the different sections of the course, versus the section screen is going to allow you to play the video, and also it's going to allow you to read the content, the article. But the cover itself respects the same structure. And that's why, you know, I duplicate this one, I create this one, and now for the profile, let's do the same, because it's going to have a very similar structure, because we're going to use a cover now. Okay. All right. The second part is to remove the stuff that you don't need. So for example, I'm not going to need a favorite because this is a profile. This is not a social network. And I don't have a play button, so I'm going to remove that. Okay. This is going to be a modal design. It's not going to be a course, so I don't need this logo. I do need the avatar. And since it's a modal design, it's going to come from the bottom and not from the left. And so this back button doesn't make sense, and I'm going to move this to the left. Okay? I'm going to respect my spacing if it's 20 from the left, right? So you want to make sure that when you're setting the ruler, so Shift R, so everything is aligned, even though the text is in the, you know, is centered. If you put it to the left, everything is aligned. So you want to make sure to do that so that your design feels cleaner and that the eye can scan it in a better way. So, all right, 20 from the left, and then we're going to do 20 from the right. Okay, I'm going to use SF symbols. Let's go to SF symbols. By the way, if you enjoy these live streams, please give us a like, because I'm trying to get better at this, and you know, it really helps to know that you are enjoying this, and I should do more of this. So let me search for, so in iOS and any of Apple's platform, you have access to this beautiful SF symbol. So we have about 2,500 icons, and you can use them in all of your apps. It works in SwiftUI, it works in the design tool. And so I'm just gonna copy and paste, boom. There you go, I have my close button, and that's it. So now I have the avatar, and I wanna make sure that I have consistent spacing. Typically, I'm gonna set the spacing dividable by 4. So 8 is fine, and 4 between these two titles, that's fine. And now we're gonna change the name. So now it's going to be my name, or the name of the person, and then the bio. So the bio is gonna be, let me just copy and paste the text. There you go. And I'm gonna set this to white. 34 might be a little bit big, but it actually works quite fine. I do like that. I mean, typically 34 is for the largest title in most screens. So 28 is a pretty good number that I like to use as well. And I can make this a little bit longer, maybe like this. I'm gonna set this to white instead, and the same for this. One thing that I really like about Figma is that they have these selection colors, so sometimes I don't need to select. So when I have multiple layers, I don't need to select each of those layers to change the colors. And I can just change it from the selection color here, which is pretty nice. So I'm gonna set this to, I press F and enter. So this is a good trick for your workflow. You just, if you want to set to white, don't click here and you can go to white. Just press F, enter. It's gonna go white automatically. Press 0, enter. It's gonna go to black automatically. So a little power trick that I like to use a lot. All right. If you enjoy the music, you can definitely like this video for sure. All right. Okay, so we have this text here, and clearly it's gonna be in the way of the illustration. The question is, what is the illustration for each profile? And maybe we have to think about, you know, having a preset illustration that is maybe randomized, or maybe eventually allow people to have their own illustration to be uploadable. So those are question marks but for now I'm just gonna, you know, keep it like this because it's pretty interesting. And I also like, maybe we can move that in the background like this. By the way, oftentimes in Figma, it's really annoying when you have like auto layout and you drag it around, it goes inside auto layout. So to fix that, it's not the best solution, but you can select it and you press space at the same time. So it's never gonna go inside the auto layout. So if I put it here, so it's, you know, it looks pretty good. All right. So of course, right now I'm cheating a little bit. But yeah, that's kind of cool. I don't need this part, so I can remove it. And yeah, play around with the colors. Let's play around with the colors together. I'm glad you're having fun with the music. All right. You know, like, I make mistakes. I'm still new to streaming, even though I've been doing these a little bit weekly lately. All right, so one thing that I suggest you to do is try to save your gradients, okay? So here I have a bunch of gradients saved. If you don't know where to find the gradients, you know, there's a bunch of resources such as gradient, coolers, and you're gonna find like a lot of gradients and colors that you can use for your app. Now, keep in mind that these are tools. Just like coding, you need practice in order to get good at it. So it's not because like you have a bunch of gradients that you can just use anywhere. Practice it first, get feedback from designers, from developers, and you're gonna get there, right? Colors takes a little bit of time. Another thing that really helped me is to practice photography. Photography allows you to practice your lighting, your sense of colors, environments, focus, and all of those things. By the way, I did focus I did solve the camera issue, so you can see it's no longer doing this crazy autofocus anymore. So one problem solved. Anyways, you can see here I have a bunch of gradients, and you know, I can play around with these gradients. So I like to save these gradients so that I can play and, you know, switch around and see how it looks like. You know, so for example, you can see here. So let's change to a different gradient. All right, so I don't know. I'm gonna use another one here. It's really slow, so my experimentation level is very limited. When it's faster, I can, you know, see, I've been playing with a bunch of gradients. Obviously, I'm not going to use the radial one, and I'm not using a light gradient. Otherwise, my text, I'm going to have to change that to black, which could be also interesting. yeah, let's try light mode. 0, enter, 0, enter, boom, good contrast. 0, enter, and then 0, enter, good contrast. There you go. All right, let's go with this one. The same thing. 0, enter, and this is fine. There you go. So obviously I'm gonna want to hide this portion because it's not nice. So maybe I can move this around a little bit to hide it. Oh my god, this speed is killing me. All right, so let me drag it. Space. All right. Okay, it's hidden. I'm like moving so slow right now. It's insane. Okay, we're getting there. So play around with colors, really, like have fun with it and get feedback. We have a Discord, by the way. And, you know, if you want to share your design in Discord, I'm happy to give you feedback on Discord, especially if you're a subscriber. We have a place for our subscribers. We love to take care of our subscribers because they're the reason we're still in business. So if you want to like play with the gradients, play with colors, you want to get feedback on this, you know, jump in. All right, so let's play with these colors, some of these gradients. Let's see. Let's experiment until it works. I mean, this one looks pretty good. It fits well. Sometimes you're gonna have to play with the opacity a little bit. So I'm gonna go into this menu here. Maybe I want this part to have less opacity. Okay. And yeah, what else? Maybe this yellow here to have less opacity. Okay, I do have a linear light for some reason. There you go. So when you use opacity, it fits better with the background. And of course, you can also use a layer blur. I can set it to, I don't know, 40 if you want to make it fit even better with the background. Sometimes, you know, I do like to see the shapes itself. So I'm going to keep that. And what else? Yeah, just move it around. Uh-oh, I just got a dislike. It's probably because of the music. Apologize. All right, so you can see it creates really interesting effects. And get it until it's fun, you know, like until you feel like this is good. Play it around, play with different colors. And try to use analogous colors, you know, colors that are kind of like similar in the hues. So for example, if I'm playing with purple, I might want to use blue next to it. So I also might want to use pink. I might want to use red. And if I'm playing with red, I might want to use yellow, which is next to it. So that's exactly what I'm doing right now. I'm trying to use colors that are closest to the ones that I'm using here. And sometimes when it doesn't match, like this one, it doesn't match at all. So I can use a blur effect. All right, like this. So when I use a blur effect, yeah, it actually fits better. The only problem with the blur effect is that you might want to implement that in CSS or in SwiftUI. If not, if you want to export the whole thing as an SVG or as a PDF, first of all, on the web, it does affect performance when you have like very massive blurs. This is something I learned the hard way. What I can say is that you can try to use less blur. So the higher the blur, the more it's going to affect performance in your SVG. From my experience, iOS does like backdrop filter or background blur has a much better performance than using layer blur. So be mindful of that. So yeah, this is what we have so far, and maybe I can make this a little bit bigger to make it fit better. Okay, so it's getting a bit dark. in the middle. So this portion here is a little bit dark, so I'm gonna use a little bit of opacity. So always make sure that your text is readable. And yeah, it's looking pretty good. You know, takes a lot of time, a lot of patience, but eventually you're gonna get there. So let's say we have something like this. This is a little bit weird. Maybe I can use layer blur again. Yeah, I'll get there, but I think you get the point. It's not gonna be perfect during a live stream for sure. All right. So the drop shadow itself, it's using a contextual drop shadow, which means that I want to make sure that it's roughly the same color as the background here. So I'm gonna use, I'm gonna just change the hue. So if you already have an existing drop shadow and it's purple, I'm just gonna move the hue to roughly orange, like this. And there you go. All right, this looks pretty good. And of course, you can play with the size. We don't want to have like too much blank space here neither, right? Like this is kind of a bit of a wasted space. Unless we want our users to have like long bios. And we have some spam here. So if we have a moderator, all right. So I can't multitask to a point where I can kick spammers at the moment, but I'm going to try to have more, moderators to help us in the future. But I'm almost done anyway. So let me just bring these cards, and I'm gonna put that at the bottom of the UI. There you go. Boom. So that's what we have so far. And yeah, that's basically my design process when I create new screens. When you have an established design language, it really makes the job a lot more inspired. I think the key word here is to be inspired. When you're inspired, it really helps with the speed of the process. It helps with the communication. It helps with your own satisfaction as a designer or as a developer. You get people excited with you, and so yeah, absolutely. Anyways, I'm gonna be taking some questions, and yeah, it's not perfect. I would definitely love to play a little bit more, but I just wanted to explain the process and some of the key things that I would do. So absolutely. So if you want to drop by to our Discord channel, you can just drop your designs, and we're happy to give you some feedback and some direction if this works or if this does not work. Wouldn't it be better to export everything as a whole image? Yes, as I mentioned earlier, ideally you want to be able to design everything and animate everything from scratch. But the thing is, you have to also think about the process. Okay, so if I wanted to make all of these layers to be animated and designed from scratch, then I have to think about all the 30 courses that's going to have their own illustration and therefore requiring a lot of development time. And that's why I want to limit that at the moment. We don't have the resources to have one designer spending a few days on each illustration and animation. We don't have the resources yet, but maybe in the future we will. But for now, in order to be efficient, we're just going to set this as a flat image. I see people are interested in the track, the music that was in the background. It's basically iTunes, and let me see. This is funny. It's no longer called iTunes. It's music now. So when you have an established design language, it really does help a lot, especially if you have junior designers in your team. Um, Make sure to have like a design language, a design system, a good branding, and from there, it's really much more harmonious to work as a team, especially when you have a lot of like junior designers in the team. So the music that we played was, anyways, I don't recently play. I think this Mento Station or something. I think, and so it was just a collection of music inspired by my playlist. So if you liked it, I can help you there. Um, I would like to check Stripe big manipulation between, yeah, the Konami code is really interesting as well. That is probably using a bunch of keyboard shortcuts for that. What is the process you would go through to hand the design off to the development team? Yeah, so I think it's important to explain, how it's been implemented, but most importantly, oftentimes you're gonna have to also set yourself as a designer the culture in code, especially pertaining to the UI. So, for example, oftentimes what I would do, I would go and design and implement the first apps. Okay, and after implementing the first apps, then the other developers can come in and look at some of the stuff that I've been doing, and they can just take it from there and understand how I am organizing my layers, organizing my design system. So, how do I organize the illustration? What are the sizes and stuff like that? So I like to do it myself, but if you don't have the experience to do that, do it everything in Figma. So let me give you an example. You need to set these text style in advance that is perfectly adapted to the dynamic type in iOS. If you don't know what dynamic type is, it's iOS design system, right? If you go to the human interface guideline, it's going to have a portion about typography and dynamic type, and this is what everyone should be using, and it makes a lot of sense because it adapts to the accessibility options. So you're gonna have these dynamic text such as large title, and depending on the accessibility option by the user. By default is large, but otherwise you can go to extra large and the font size is going to change automatically. So as a result, you want to set this design system, the text styles, directly in your design. So for example, this one is called footnote, and you're going to add semi-bold and uppercase. This is called footnote. This is called large title, and I might as well just put large title, which is right here. There you go. So once you have that and you hand it off to the developer, they look at it and they can basically just use the dynamic type, which is a single line of code. They don't need to set up a custom font. And so that makes the whole process and development process so much easier and, and harmonious with the design itself. You want to set your components. You want to set all the screens. You want to make sure that it adapts to different sizes. You want to set your colors. If you set all of these things in advance, then it's going to be so much easier to work with developers. I do have a course about design system, by the way, and I also have a course about UI design for developers. And if you want to learn more about all of this stuff, like the sort of like design system aspect, I think the course is going to really help you a lot. But yeah, today I wanted to focus really on the colors, the blobs, the design process, and how I create new screens, and how I think about inspiration and things like that. And I hope you enjoy it. And please give a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and I'll try to do these once or twice a week. So I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.